Mm-hmm. For a while. Mm-hmm. Okay. Especially the qualitative design because it's highly emergent. Meaning to say, it keeps changing. It adapts to whatever is demanded or whatever is needed in the field of research or in your own discipline. So if you say that this is no longer applicable during this time, especially there are many changes that we expect to happen after the COVID pandemic. For example, the usual interview that we follow, the face-to-face interview will no longer be that helpful this time because you cannot have face-to-face data collection anymore. So perhaps what will emerge as the trend in data collection for qualitative research this time is the virtual or the online interview or online focus group discussion. So that's the trend. So these are methods. These are procedures in research. These are not designs. All right. So these are specific methods of a certain design. So that's how I want you to distinguish designs from methods. Okay. So research designs can either be quantitative or grouped according to their approach. So it can be either a quantitative research design, a qualitative research design, and a mixed methods research design. So let's look at the quantitative approach. So what are the designs under the quantitative approach? Okay, so we have the experimental design, we have the non-experimental design, and the quasi-experimental design. I'll show some guidelines or general guidelines how this experimental, non-experimental, and quasi-experimental designs are being conducted later. So the generic. So if you think that there's another experimental type of research that you can recommend aside from the three, then you can basically propose that. Okay, so and a correlational survey or correlational or associational surveys. People will also use descriptive. Okay, so I always ask myself, where does this term come from? The descriptive research design, because apparently, for Creswell doesn't recognize descriptive research design as a design because apparently when you have the specific design, sorry. Na-trigger ang iro.
Okay na sir, klaro naman pod.
Okay na siya, sige.
Okay na sir.
Alright, so yun. I wonder also where does this descriptive research design, it's very common actually. So there are many theses that will say that this is a descriptive research or this follows a descriptive research design. Creswell doesn't recognize descriptive research design much as a design because apparently when you have any of these designs, you will have the descriptive component. So every research will really have a descriptive component. The descriptive component will present the demographics, for example, for your quantitative research. It will also look at the characteristics of the participants for your qualitative research. So apparently, it's always there. Descriptive component is always present in all research designs. So not it can. We don't usually recognize it as a standalone research design. So if you look at this classifications, we don't have that descriptive research design. So later when you have your own research, for example, in your thesis, maybe it's any of this. So you can pick any of this, not necessarily a descriptive research design because descriptive is really a part of any of these designs. I hope that's clear to you. All right. So for the qualitative research, these are the major qualitative research designs, but there are many others that emerge out of this. So there are many other qualitative research designs now that claim that they are a standalone research design, and they have their own research methods or set of methods or prescribed or suggested methods, and then they have the complete epistemological foundation and the ontological foundation. So, but generally, when you say qualitative research, it basically focuses on this five. We have the narratives or the narrative qualitative research, the phenomenological qualitative research or the phenomenology, the grounded theory. So you see, grounded theory is now classified under qualitative research. But for the pure qualitative research, for the pure grounded theories also, if you read the books of Glaser, Glaser will also say na we are a research design itself because we are also complete with the ontology and the epistemological foundation. So they will not say that we are under qualitative research because we encompass all of this. We are quanti, we are quali, we are mixed. So that's another story. But again, books do not recognize them. So it only shows that the scholarly community or the scientific community doesn't actually recognize grounded theory as a standalone research design. So Creswell classifies grounded theory under qualitative research design. We have ethnographies and some case studies. Okay, so for mixed methods research, basically this is now the combination of quali, quanti, and or quali and quanti. So we have the convergent, explanatory, and exploratory sequential. We have the transformative or the all other designs. We will be specifically talking about this in the succeeding parts of my discussion this morning. Okay, so we'll look at the research methods. Okay, so these are designs, and then specifically we'll have the methods. These are some of the general classification of methods. But again, as I have said, you can play around with your method. So it doesn't mean that this is what is suggested. You cannot have your own. So you are free and you have all the right to do it your own way. However, you find it applicable in your context, as long as you are able to show that it will not affect the rigor and the quality of your research. So you have to also to argue that this doesn't affect the quality and the rigor of the research that I am undertaking. So even if I say so, for example, there are books that will tell you that for parametric test it has to be over 30 respondents. There are also studies that will tell you that even if you have 15 or 10, you can conduct independent samples t-test, for example, or other parametric tests, because they claim that even if you don't meet this suggested number of respondents, you can still mathematically they show that the rigor is the same. It will not change much the result. So it's one way of showing to you that pwedeng baliin yung mga sinasabi ng mga libro kung paano gagawin yung isang design. So if you think that this is not applicable to your context, then you can argue. You can look for references. You can look for precedents that this was done before. Or you can prove it yourself. You can have a proof that this doesn't affect the rigor of your research. I hope you follow. Let's look at the quantitative research design and the qualitative on the other end. When it comes to the flow of the process or of the method, the quantitative is highly predetermined. So what is the implication of a predetermined research? When you say it's predetermined, everything is set at the onset of your research or at the beginning part of your research. Meaning to say, you set the number of samples, for example. So this has to be the number of samples that you will satisfy. Lower than this or higher than this is not acceptable. Or you set the research questions and the hypothesis ahead. You set the relationships ahead. Meaning to say, whatever relationship that you establish at the start, you cannot change that along the way. So it has to be the same thing that you will test, even if you discover that it doesn't make sense anymore to test these relationships. So that's the nature of quantitative research. You have predetermined, you have preset everything. The opposite to that is the qualitative, because in qualitative research, the process is highly emerging. When you say it's emerging, it depends on the context where you apply the procedure or the method. So if the set or the plan doesn't apply anymore, then you can change it in qualitative research. In quanti, you cannot. Even the title in your research, you cannot change it if it is a quantitative research because it has been preset. Meaning to say, because the title tells you the scope of your research, you cannot also change the title because apparently you cannot change the scope of your research. So the problem arises, as we have discussed in our previous meeting, this deterministic nature of quantitative research is also a limitation because uh, apparently you cannot set everything ahead. There will be changes that you will encounter along the way. So, for example, you will not satisfy the number of respondents, and if you do not satisfy the number of respondents, apparently for the quantitative research design, it is not acceptable because you have preset it and you have been approved to do it, especially when it went through ethical review or ethics committee review, because the ethics committee review will tell you that whatever is approved, that's what you are going to implement. If you cannot follow what has been approved, then that is not ethical. Okay, so that's the problem. Okay, so in between quali and quanti, we have the mixed methods research, which is both predetermined and an emerging research design. If you notice, my introduction in our first lecture is to encourage you to do mixed methods research because it entails a lot of flexibility. So when you want to be very flexible in your research, do some mixed methods research design because it's both predetermined. You can preset it. However, whatever changes or whatever circumstances along the way, that can help you decide whether you will change or not. And if you change, it's valid because it's part of your design. It's a mixed methods research design. If you are purely quantitative, it is not justifiable to do that because quantitative is predetermined. Whatever is planned, whatever is set, you cannot change that. All right. So the implication of that when it comes to instrument is um, our instruments in quantitative research is highly closed-ended, or it cannot be modified. It cannot be changed. All right. So the questions that you ask, for example, in a survey are the same questions all throughout. Okay, so if you are surveying, for example, students of the College of Business and Accountancy, that's going to be the same instrument that you will use when you survey another set of students from another college, because that's the nature or that's the design of quantitative research. You cannot have different you cannot have different instruments if you are measuring the same thing. So one construct or one dimension or one concept translates into one set of questions or one questionnaire. In qualitative research, it's not like that because you can start with a preliminary set of questions, or you can have a very general interview question, for example, or a survey question, for example. And then, after you gather the first set of data, for example, the first unit of analysis is one FGD. So after one FGD, you can or you may change the questions in your questionnaire. So when you say interview protocol, it's not fixed. It's not going to be uh, closed questionnaire wherein you cannot change, right, you cannot change anymore. Okay, so it's both emerging and it's open-ended. So in qualitative research, respondents are free to respond according to their specific context. Unlike in quantitative research, they cannot respond according to their context. Sometimes, if you notice, when we answer surveys, sometimes the options in the survey do not necessarily represent our context. So sometimes we are just forced to accept or to make a choice or to select a choice in a survey, even if it doesn't represent our idea or it doesn't represent our experience, because there's no other choice. Okay, so that's the limitation. In qualitative research, you can express the real context or the answer that is truly reflective or that is truly representative of your context because you are free to respond. It's an open-ended question. Again, in mixed, you can have both. Again, flexibility wise, it's advisable to have the mixed methods research. In quantitative research, because everything is predetermined, everything is exact and objective, use statistical tools, or we can use mathematics to predict, or we can use mathematics to look at the pattern of the behavior, because everything is measured, everything is numbered, it's numerical. So apparently, you can apply statistical tools or statistical procedures in analyzing those. In qualitative research, because you are being given text, or you are being given verbal data or data other than numbers, then the statistics cannot be used, because apparently you will be doing some level of conceptualization, analysis of the text, analysis of the image, analysis of the video, for example. And these are all subjective, and these are all dependent on the epistemological and the theoretical perspective, or the worldview of the one doing the analysis. So to make it more flexible, again, we have the mixed methods in between. Do you still follow?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Let me know
Sir.
if I'm moving
Sir.
too fast. Pwede ra?
Okay, sir.
Masundan ra? Sige, reklamo lang ha. Iisain yung tiil pag hindi na ma-upsat. Okay, so again, we have the approach, quantitative, qualitative, and we can split further qualitative into either constructivist qualitative and transformative qualitative, and then the mixed methods research design. Let's look at quantitative. What are the key terms that you need to define in quantitative research? Crucial in quantitative research is to understand a variable. What is a variable? Because we say that everything is quantified in quantitative research. From the name itself, it's quantified. So we look at what does it mean to have a variable in a quantitative research, or what do you mean by a variable? So simply said, a variable is a characteristic, or an attribute, or a description, or a behavior, or any characteristic of an individual, or a group of individuals, or an organization that can be measured or observed. So what are examples of variables? Your grade, for example, is a variable. Your frequency of taking a particular medicine, for example, is a variable. This can be measured, or this can be observed. For example, your attitude towards this course is an example of a variable, because there's a way of determining your attitude towards this course based on a particular scale. Okay, so we can have we can classify variables as either independent or dependent. And in some higher statistical procedures, we can analyze variables based on their mediation and moderation effects on a particular relationship. So, what is an independent variable? An independent variable is a variable that doesn't change or doesn't depend on the value, the behavior, the characteristic of another variable. The dependent is a variable that is dependent on the value of another variable. So the dependent is dependent on the independent variable. So the feeder, the input is the independent. The output is actually what we mean by the dependent. So the dependent variable will, for example, depend on the value of an independent variable. I'd like to give an example. So your understanding of a course, for example, or a concept can be considered as a dependent variable. So what are the factors that will that contribute to your understanding of a course or a concept? So it could be the manner the teacher handles the course, or the teaching strategy of the teacher. It could be the time that or the schedule of the course, or the schedule of the class, the mode, whether it's online or face to face. So these are all independent variables. So in that particular relationship, these independent variables can affect your grade, which is the dependent variable. So your grade or your performance in a course is dependent on something else or some other variables. Independent variables are called sometimes as factors, and the dependent variable is what we mean by the output or the um, or the dependent variable. Okay, so in some other statistical analysis, like for example, in structural equation modeling, such as path analysis, there are some variables that will serve as mediating or a moderating variable. So these are variables that affect the relationship of the independent and dependent along the way. So directly, we can say that the teaching strategy of the teacher is dependent or affects the performance of the student. And in between the performance and the teaching strategy, there are other factors. We call these factors as either mediating factors or the moderating factors. Okay, so these are variables. Next. I'd like to look at
Yes.
the placement of theory in your quantitative research because theories are very important in our research because people will say that theory is either giving the structure, giving the backbone of your research, or others will say that theory is basically what we aim to discover in our research. So let's differentiate the placement of theory or how we locate theory in quantitative research and in qualitative research. Okay, so what is a theory? It's a set of interrelated constructs or a set of relationships or a set of related variables, for example. So perhaps there's a theory that relates um, pleasing personality of a teacher and the level of academic performance of the students. I do not know if there's such a theory that exists this time, but you can create a theory out of that. So what are the set of interrelated variables here? So the pleasing personality can be in the form of how fair the skin is, or however you will define pleasing personality. For example, the quality of your smile, the way you look at your students, for example. This could be plugged into a model that could affect the academic performance of the students. So that can be a theory. For example, we can have the Arbonne's theory of learning. So it's affected by that. So it's what we mean by a theory, or it's a set of interrelated constructs or variables that you set or that you model, wherein it entails relationship of specific variables or concepts, and you will be able to test these relationships. We call it hypothesis. So there's going to be a set or a series of testing of different hypotheses. Okay. Theories provide an overarching explanation of how and why one would expect the independent variable to explain or predict the dependent variable. So we have said that variables can be dependent and independent, and they are showing a certain relationship. So I'd like you to imagine there's one box, and then there's an arrow coming from that box pointing to another box. So that's an independent variable pointing into the dependent variable, or it's the dependent variable that affects the dependent variable. So a theory is basically the framework that explains that relationship. Okay, so how do you see that in your research? This can be seen in the literature review, in the literature synthesis, wherein you will see the different theories and the different interrelated constructs of the theory that will help you shape the relationship that you will be testing in your research. So it's either you are basically getting the entire theory to relate to another theory, or you are picking a certain construct or a certain variable from a theory, and then you allow it to relate to the construct or a variable from another theory. We call it your conceptual framework, right? So what you can find in your conceptual frameworks are the different variables and the relationship of these variables, or the assumed relationship of these variables. So if you happen to have research done before, so go back to your conceptual framework. What does your conceptual framework consist of? So these are different variables. These are constructs. And how do you deal with the constructs? You allow to relate these constructs. But recently, because of the highly unpredictable and an ambiguous relationship of the variables, relationship is highly fluid, or relationship is highly unpredictable. That's why we have this structural equation modeling wherein everything is just placed in a space, for example, and then you allow these variables to relate however they will behave. So we cannot predict ahead the relationship, but we can model the relationship based on the behavior according to our set of data, for example. So that's how sophisticated modeling and modeling research is this time. Okay, so you can actually do a research like that. So instead of putting some arrows in your conceptual framework, you can just put all the variables there. So if your panel member will ask you, what relationship are you actually testing? So you will tell them that I do not know. I will have to find out in this research yet. I just think that logically they are related, and the manner or the model of that relationship or the extent of that relationship is still unknown to me. I have to find out. I still have to find out in this research. And that's the purpose of this research, to find out what kind of relationship exists between these two or among these variables. So in your theory, I'll have a series of hypotheses because, again, your hypothesis is the statement that will uh, articulate your guest relationship, or the relationship that you are predicting, or the relationship that you are uh, attempting to find out or to investigate in your research. It's a series of if-then logic statements. So your theory will tell you that if, for example, if the teacher, if a female teacher will wear this much volume of makeup, then the students will learn better, or this much. Okay, so it's an if-then logic statement. So I'm just, exaggerating examples, but it's basically like that. So when you do research, it's basically looking at if there's a certain scenario, if there's a certain context or a certain situation, then this will happen like this. So it's an if-then logic. Theories are usually presented in visual models. So you have the diagram of the relationships. You'll have the graphics of the relationships. And in your first assignment, I ask you, I was looking at the way you represent your ideas. So the way you set hierarchies of ideas, the way you set relationship of ideas is basically theorizing. So you are actually starting or attempting to look at uh, or arrange concepts or ideas logically or theoretically according to their logic, according to the elaboration of their characteristic or their logical attributes. Okay, so that's basically doing some level of theorizing in your first research, in your first task. This one is a visual model of the relationship of variables. Basically, the most uh, generic relationship. For example, we have here z1 as your dependent variable. So, what are dependent variables? These are variables that depend on something else. So, what are the variables that will affect the dependent variable now? We have one, the x1, affecting the z. Normally, the dependent variables are using the y. So even in your mathematics, you notice that y is always equal to the relationship of the x's. Okay, so how x affects the y. So in this case, for example, z1 is influenced by the x1, which is your independent variable 1, x2 via a certain intervening variable, and x3 directly or via an intervening variable. Okay, so you can see there that in a more generic term, the dependent variable is influenced by the independent variables using this fashion. All right, so here's how it goes in quantitative research. You basically start with the theory in quantitative research. I'm referring to, when I say theory in this case, I'm referring to the theory that governs the concept that you're trying to investigate. It doesn't apply to the theory that governs your methods of research. So I'd like you to separate the theoretical framework and the methodological framework. Your methodological framework will also use theories, but these theories will explain your methodology or your methods. The theoretical framework is the theory that will explain the concept or the relationship of concepts that you are trying to investigate. These are different. Okay, so I don't want you to have a mix up understanding of these two. Okay, so we have the methodological framework and the theoretical framework. What we are referring to in this example or in this presentation is a theoretical framework, the framework that influences the concept and the relationship of concepts that you are investigating. So how does it go in your quantitative research? You start with the theory. This is noticeable in your framework, right? So your advisor will tell you that no, you have to start with the theory because without the theory you cannot do research. So I'm going to show that that is a very one-sided understanding of research. So when you hear your advisor saying that you cannot do research without a theory or a theoretical framework, that's a very positivist understanding. He doesn't understand research at all, because a researcher who understands the dual continuum of research will always tell you that there's always a research that doesn't start with the theory. But in quantitative research, it's always given that you start with the theory. So as I've said, our training is always quantitative. Our universities are highly quantitative in nature. Okay, so qualitative research has a very limited space or place in universities. Very few are actually advocating qualitative research, and our most of our teachers are trained quantitatively. So they will tell you cannot start a research without a theory. So this is how this explains that. So because in quantitative research, you start with a theory basically. So you start with a theory and then you articulate in your theoretical or your conceptual framework the relationship of the variables extracted from the theory. And the purpose of your research is basically to investigate whether the hypothesized relationship actually is represented by or demonstrated by the set of samples. So for example, if you pick a set of samples from JRMSU and you are going to test the theory that kung unsa ka baga ang makeup ni teacher, natupod ka kusog ang pagsabot sa bata sa iyang leksyon. So you are going to test that. All right? So basically, it's verifying a theory. So you have already some theories, and then you are trying to verify whether that theory is indeed exemplified by the set of samples. Okay. Next is the researcher is the purpose of the research is to test those hypotheses, as I've said, or research questions from the theory. And then the researcher will define and operationalize the variables derived from the theory, and then the researcher will go to the field and gather the data or gather the survey, and then he will analyze the data, and then he will tell you that yes, the hypothesized relationship of variables is true. Okay, so when you, for example, when you hypothesize that there is a significant relationship between the volume of makeup and the level of understanding of the teacher, then you will now give a result. There is a significant relationship between, or you may say, if you do some higher level of statistics, you will say that the volume of makeup is contributing a factor of 1.2 to the volume of, or to the understanding of students to the lesson. So so if you have this much volume, the students will understand also this much. So it's a crazy example, but I'm just demonstrating how theory affects your process of investigation. Okay, next. Let's go to the qualitative research. The use of theory in qualitative research is different. Theory in qualitative research is used as a broad explanation for behavior and attitudes. It provides a lens for a transformative intention, and it is an end point of your research and not a starting point. So if you notice, in quantitative research, it is the starting point. But in qualitative research, it's your endpoint. So in qualitative research, you basically are developing a theory, or you are articulating a set of relationships that may not necessarily translate into a theory, but may lead into the development of a more um, defined, or a more established, or a more clear, or a clearer mid-range theory. Okay, so, or you can have no theory at all. Okay, so again, we're referring to the conceptual, or the theory that governs the concept or the topic or the issue that you are investigating, not the methodological theory. Am I clear? Okay, sige. After this illustration, I'm going to stop and then ask you questions. All right, so the opposite is true in your qualitative research. If you notice, this is how your qualitative research, theory use would look like. So you start with, so from the bottom, you read from the bottom. So you have the interviews or the observations right away, or the data right away, right? So you get the data right away, and then you develop the generalization. So the generalization now will become either the theory, or a success, an established theory, or a dimension to a theory, or a concept leading to a theory, or a relationship leading to a theory. So in quantitative research, you are testing or verifying an existing relationship. Here, you are developing or formulating a relationship. So that's the difference. So in qualitative research, you are actually getting the data first so that you can create the theory, not the other way around. Quantitative research, you start with the theory, and then you gather the data that will tell you about the theory, or that will prove the theory. So you are being selective, apparently because you want to select only those that will represent, or will be able to answer, the proposed or the hypothesized relationship. Okay, so I'll stop, and then I'll spend some time answering clarifications, or addressing some questions or concerns regarding what we have covered so far. Hello, Moy. Hingugpod mo. Ma'am Nisa.
Why did you
Padungga daw mo sa imong tingog, Ma'am Nis. Mas tig-ik lang.
Tuktuga, oh.
Are things clear, Ma'am Nisa?
Yes, sir.
Any insight you would like to share? Any significant reflection point or reflection that you'd like to share to your classmates or to the class?
Regarding with the dili po ko sure, sir. Pero confused lang ko, sir, ba? Based sa slides. So, the deductive theory and the qualitative theory, sir, it states there that they both starts with a theory.
No. The inductive of quali starts with the data and develops towards the theory. You notice the arrow? Baliktad ang arrow ato.
Baliktad.
Pa-down to ang isa ka arrow ato, ma'am. Pa-up, sorry, siguro. Kailangan na to i-emphasize. So, I hope that you notice the arrow, ha? Kasi ang arrow ato, gikan to sa taas ang isa ka arrow pababa. And then, ang isa naman, gikan sa baba pataas to. So I hope you won't get confused with that. Kasi that's the difference between the deductive approach and the inductive approach. Okay na ka?
Okay na, sir.
Okay, sige. Tanawa balik tong PDF nga atong gipadala para makita nimo nga lahi og direksyon ng arrow. Ma'am Daisy, kumusta Ma'am Daisy? Any insight, any learning that you'd like to share, or anything that you can add to the discussion that I may have missed to discuss?
Hello, sir. It's okay. I understand, sir, that qualitative and quantitative is so different because we start with the theory and getting the data by the qualitative, and quantitative starts with we are using the variables and some
Okay.
statistical methods.
Sige, I will trust you with that, ha? So I will trust that you have understood that. Okay. So ganun na yun. If you tell me that you understand, okay, so let's proceed. Let's advance. Unless there are things that you would like to have more clarification. Let me know if you're not learning anymore, then we'll stop this. Magbunglay sa ta. Okay, so let's advance. Okay, next. All right, so in mixed methods research, apparently you are applying both flexibility with the use of any of those. Okay, so we have the frameworks that govern the use of quali and
Sa-
quanti altogether. Ma'am Nisa,
Yes, sir.
you're saying something?
Ako na na-view, sir. Sorry, sir. Wala na nakamute.
So, na-realize niya nga naarad dito sa slide. Subot pa subot, wag niya gibasa. Sakpan tuloy. Sakpan ka, ma'am, no? Sige. Okay, so let's look at the different frameworks of combining and exercising flexibility in combining both quali and quanti. So the social science theory says that, or the social science theory is an overarching framework for mixed methods. In social science, kasi we always look at, or research in social science will tell you that what is important in research is what can make the lives of people better. So if you use mixed methods research, it follows generally the social science theory or the social science framework, which tells you that the research is all about making sure that your research will translate into something that can help people live a better life. So pang Miss Universe ang purpose ng mixed methods research. Because you do research in order to make the lives of others or the people or human beings better. Okay, so to make a to make the world a better place to live in. Okay, so that's basically the social science theory. Theory is used as a priori framework to inform questions and hypotheses and guide data collection and data analysis. You may use theory at the start, but the main purpose of that theory is to make sure that it translates into what is good for the people. So the implication to that is because what the people or the society or the social impact is more important than the research question or the research hypothesis, whatever will help the society will dictate your questions. So you see the difference? In quantitative research, it's merely questions, theory, questions, and hypothesis. But in mixed methods research, it's all it's there's a there's this, or your impact to the society is more important than the research question or the hypothesis. So if your research will tell you that there is a need to change the research question or research hypothesis because this is not what the society wants or this is not what the society needs, then you can do that. So again, flexibility. So because the overarching framework is the social science framework or the social science theory. Okay, so yun. All right, so in quantitative research design, we have survey and experimental methods. We have the quasi-experimental design, non-experimental design, and experimental design. You can have descriptive analysis as a component of any of these designs. So you can have associational inferential analysis as a process of analyzing your data from the surveys and experiments. You can also have the comparative inferential analysis. And let's talk a bit about the threats to validity in your quantitative research design. Okay, let's look at surveys and experiments. Survey design is a quantitative description of trends, attitudes, or opinions of a population by a certain sample. So you provide a questionnaire or a survey questionnaire or an inventory to your set of samples, and then you look at the trend. For example, if you do it annually, then you look at the trend for a certain period of time, look at how people change their perspective, how people change their opinion, like just like what the SWS is doing or the social weather station. They basically look at the change or the trend of people's approval, for example, of the president. They look at the change of people's perspective or people's understanding of the political issues. This is what we mean by a survey design. An experimental design tests the impacts of a treatment. So there's always a treatment in an experimental design um, to an outcome or to an to a dependent variable, and controlling for all other factors that might influence the outcome. So let's look at the details of this experimental design later. In instrumentation, we have look at the content, the construct, and the validity or the reliability also. There are some key considerations when you are using instruments in a survey. For example, if you are using a survey of another person or another research or another researcher, then you are either adapting, adapt with an O, or adapting, adapt with an A. So what's the difference between adapting an instrument with an O and adapting an instrument? Adapting an instrument with an A is using an instrument, but you are modifying it. So you're changing something. For example, even if you change the example given in the instrument, or even if you change the language in the instrument, that's adapting already. So if you change one word in the instrument, you're already adapting it. Okay, so there are rules or there are guidelines in both adapting a questionnaire and in adopting a questionnaire with an O. Adapting a questionnaire is basically using the instrument as is, without changes, without modification to the instrument. So if you are adopting an instrument with an O, meaning to say you did not change anything, basically the instrument is supposed to retain its validity and its reliability because you did not change anything. It's one way of checking and testing your hypothesized relationship based on that, or as the basis of this instrument, when you administer it to several contexts or different contexts. Okay, so uh, you are you may be required to present the reliability results of the instrument as it is used in your context, but not necessarily the validity result or to do the validity testing of it. So that's the advantage of using an adapted instrument or adapting an instrument, adapt with an O. Because apparently all you need to do is just to look at the reliability test, and reliability is very easy to calculate. Just look at the Quanbox alpha of the instrument. Okay, and then you got the reliability already. Okay, when you adapt with an A, so adapting an instrument, you change something or you modify the instrument. So this is the time that you will be required, supposedly, to present both the reliability and the validity test of your instrument, because the validity results is based on where the instrument was originally developed. So it may change when you administer it to a different context after modifying it. So once you modify, you have to also undergo some validity testing. So be careful next time in your thesis or in your research. When you adapt an instrument, adapt with an A, you are required to do the validity testing and on top of the reliability testing. But if you just simply adapt with an O, all you need to do is just place the reliability results or report the reliability results of your instrument. And that could be sufficient. Although there are other journals that will also require you to do some validity testing, even if the instrument is purely adapted. The same process when you develop an instrument. So we call this the researcher-made instrument or the researcher-made survey. So if you have a researcher-made survey, it has to undergo several layers of validation and even the construct validation towards the end, together with the reliability testing. So it's more stringent. I mean, it's more difficult, and it takes time, longer time to develop. So be careful when you do your thesis, when you deal with instruments. Let's look at some of the experimental procedures. Uh, I'd like to show this pre, during, and pre-experimental designs and some quasi and true experimental designs. You may have this design. We have a pre-experimental design, or we have one-shot case study. One-shot case study is you have a certain group, and then you put a treatment, and then you test afterwards. That's a valid design. For example, you have one intact class if you're a teacher, and then you tried out a certain teaching strategy, for example. That's the treatment. And then after that, you do the test. So that's what we call as a one-shot case study research design. Follow? Another is a one group pretest post-test design. So there's only one group, but you administer a pretest before a post-test, before you give the intervention. So we go back to the example kanina. You have one class or intact class, you give a pretest first, and then you teach them using the strategy that you think is a good strategy, and then you give a post-test. So that's what we mean by that's what we call as the one group pre-test post-test research experimental design. Another is a static group comparison or a post-test only with non-equivalent group. Okay, so we have two groups. Ideally, these two groups are independent. These two groups are not equivalent, or meaning to say they are not affecting each other. So we have group A, group B. Group A will receive the intervention. The group B will not receive an intervention, or in other words, we call it the control group. Group A is the treatment group, and then you give the test afterwards. So section Marang, you have the teaching strategy. Section Avocado, no teaching strategy, or you use the traditional one, and then you give the post-test and compare their results. We call it the static group comparison or post-test only with non-equivalent groups. We have the alternative treatment post-test only with non-equivalent group design. So we have group A, we have a specific treatment. Another group will have a different treatment. Okay, so treatment 1, treatment 2, and you compare their scores or you compare the results. Do you follow? It's very easy. So what I'm showing are the possible designs of your research when you do some survey and experimental research later on. We have the single group interrupted time series design. So how do you do that? We have the group A, for example, and then you gave a series of tests. For example, 4 tests. In between, you put the intervention, and then you give another series of tests. Okay, so that's what we call as a single group interrupted time series design. Another is a control group interrupted time series design. The same thing, we have 2 groups this time. So group A, there's an intervention in between. But the second group is there is no intervention in between. But the only difference here is that there is a series of tests. The previous example, we only give the pre-test and the post-test. Here, we have a series of tests. One group, there is an intervention in between. The other group doesn't really have any intervention. You just continued with the traditional one or the conventional one. Just raise your hand or just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. You have the pre-test, post-test control group design. Okay, so this is now the true experimental designs. Okay, so the true or the real experimental design. What's the difference between a quasi-experimental and a true experimental research? In true experimental research, you randomize. So if you don't randomize, then you use the quasi-experimental. In true experimental, you really randomize. True experiments cannot be conducted in depth ed or in the educational setting. Why? Because you cannot randomize fully the students, because schools will always tell you, or educational theories will always tell us that it's not a good idea to remove certain number of students from a class just because you want to study them. So you have to place them in their intact class and study their class as a whole. You don't, you know, you don't get certain number of students only, and then the rest will be there, will stay, and then you um, recruit just 10 or 15 students only. So that's not a good idea. So through experiments is difficult to do in educational research because of that restriction, especially DepEd. DepEd is very strict to that. DepEd doesn't want you to get certain number of students from a class and then you study it separately. It's like studying some guinea pigs. DepEd doesn't want you to do that. Okay, so in true experiment, there's an example. The pre-test, post-test control group design. So how does the pre-test, post-test? You have group A selected randomly. The R there signifies that it is selected randomly. Another group, group B, is also selected randomly. You give a pre-test to group A, and then you give the treatment, and then you give the post-test. All right, so for group B, you simply give the pre-test and then the post-test right away. Okay, so that's the difference.
Walay treatment.
Walay treatment si group B. Follow?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sa post-test only control group design, wala kay pre-test because it's post-test only. The same siya ganiha sa kuan, pre-test, post-test. This one is post-test only. Naay intervention ng isa, naay treatment ng isa, ang isa wala. Pero post-test lang niyo ang gihatag. Pwede po na siya. Okay ta? You see, you can have a degree of flexibility actually in using the designs. And you can have your own. If you think that there is a need to have another one, then develop, write something that this is needed, and the examples given by Creswell will not fit to your context. Then you are obliged or you're compelled to do another one. Okay. Well, the Solomon 4 group design, I guess you're very familiar with this. So in the Solomon 4 group design, we have 4 groups selected randomly. 2 groups have pre-test and post-test. The 2 groups only have post-test. So for the 2 groups that do not have post-test, one of those 2 groups has an intervention. In the same manner, for the 2 groups that have both pre-test and post-test, one of those has the intervention or the treatment. So pre-test, intervention, post-test. Pre-test without intervention, post-test. Group C is no pre-test, there's an intervention, and there's a post-test. For group D, there is no pre-test, there's no intervention, we have the post-test only. And you will compare the 4. Follow? And then we have the single subject designs. We have the ABA subject design. It basically involves multiple observations of a single individual. So just a single individual. And then you observe by giving the pre-tests or giving the tests, and then the interventions, plural, and then another tests. All right. So yeah. Let's look at the threats to validity. History. For example, valid pa ba ang imuhang research kung nagsugod ka karon pagkahuman gitiwas nimo after 5 months? So, na siya'y threat to validity, for example, kasi walay continuity. For example, gisugdan nimo silang test karon kuana bulana. Pagkahuman after a while pa nimo gibalikan kay nag-COVID, for example, sa lugar. So there's a level of maturation or level of understanding of students may already age, not necessarily according or due to the intervention. Another is maturation. Similar to that, students may have certain level, or the participants or the samples may have certain level of maturity in terms of their understanding of the concept. So without your intervention, they may be able to answer your question already correctly, not necessarily because of your intervention. So it affects validity because you will conclude that it's because of your treatment. But in reality, it's because they matured. They have a better grasp already. They have a better understanding of it. selection, mortality, so the number of students that will remain in the test, diffusion of treatment, compensatory, resentful demoralization. This is an example in common to quasi-experimental research. So when you say quasi-experimental, you have one group that receives the treatment, the other group that doesn't receive the treatment, right? Okay, for example, the in-depth ed setting. One group or one class is given the strategy that you think is you know, beneficial. The other group doesn't receive the strategy. So the compensatory and the resentful demoralization aspect there is for those who are in the control group, those that did not receive the presumed quality teaching or quality teaching strategy. Why? Because they will feel bad because they were not selected to be part of that group that will receive the treatment, right? Kasi you hypothesize that that particular teaching strategy is good, right? You hypothesize that that teaching strategy is helpful. And then here comes another one group that you put intentionally not to experience it. So that's resentful, you know. It's it can, you know, affect the validity of your research. So it's either they will cope to prove to you that they can be, you know, also, or they will have a way of you know, sneaking to another group and, you know, looking at how they are doing it, and then they will say na ganito pala dito. So na-pollute or na-contaminate yung mga samples natin. And testing and instrumentation. For example, may problema sa lingwahe, sa ating tool or sa instrument, di naiintindihan. So these are there are some threats to validity. These are internal threats. The other set of threats are the external threats to validity. The interaction of selection and treatment. How do you select? Which group will form to the treatment? Setting and the treatment, for example, setting will also have an impact. For example, you did it in an air-conditioned room, and then the following times you did it in a non-aircon room. So apparently, it may have an effect. People or students may be more comfortable in an air-conditioned room rather than in a non-air-conditioned room. So they may have a better mindset when they answer the tool, for example. Interaction of history and treatment. Okay. Questions so far? We'll have a quick break. I guess I have spent longer time already without having a break. So I guess we deserve a quick health break. We'll have a 5-minute break. Just have some personal things. Gusto mag-CR, CR sa. Okay, I'll be back.
Quickie break, quickie.
Okay. I'll be back 10:21. Thank you.
Makaligo na dyan ko anong lakaw.
Belonoak, not yet here. Ebaw, wala din si Ebaw. Drop na ba to? Humuad. Absent si Humuad, no? Namukatkat is already here. Nyanga is already present, right? Yeah, Kael. We have Redilias. Is Shani already here? Okay, wala si Shani. Alright. Waya. Absent. Charles was here last time. Castillo was here last time. Vivero. Luzona, Katkat, Narvasan, Yangan, Yes, Ramos, Redilias, Venezuela. Alright. Okay. Let's resume.
Sir,
Yes.
with regards to the interaction of selection and treatment, are you referring to if, for example, if there are two groups, so one has the treatment, the other has none, and then there's a time that they will interact? Is that what the interaction of
No,
selection and
it's not like that. It's basically the effect of the way you you select the treatment group over the other. So,
do we also consider it as a
yeah, when
if
they
the
interact,
two groups
literally they
interact?
interact. Yeah, because apparently that
Mm,
will form part of the
so that's also a threat.
yeah, oo. Kasi for example, naghatag ka og intervention sa usa unya pagkahuman ang mga
Mm-mm.
control group nakahibalo po sila or nanglili po sila sa imong
Mm.
klase sa isa, di ba? So it affects the validity. So yun, isa yun sa mga babantayan. Anyway, other questions? Ma'am Kristen?
Ako, sir. Good morning.
Ngamayan, sige.
Regarding sa instrument in survey ba, sir,
Mm-mm.
di ba there are adapting letter A and letter O. In letter A, it required both validity and reliability. And it is said, you said, sir, that validity must be tested. Unsaan siya sa
There are
testing?
different types of validity testing. For example, you can have expert validation when you can just simply ask a so-called expert, quote-unquote expert, and then ask them if the questions that you are asking will really give you the answers that you want. That's one way of checking it. Another one is when you do some construct validation using factor analysis. For example, you can say, you can have some exploratory factor analysis using certain software or statistics and find out with the factor loading. Okay, so it validates, for example, you say that 5 items will measure this construct, and then all the 5 questions load on that particular factor. Then that tests the validity. Okay, so that's one way of testing validation. Another test of validity is saan pa ba? So these are examples of validation that you can do. In most cases, we do the factor analysis. That's the easiest. Although, pag hindi ka into mathematics or hindi ka inclined into statistics, it may be difficult, but it's the easiest to do because you just simply run the data using a software, for example, and then you can see there the result of the validation.
Thank you, sir.
You can consult books on factor analysis as a form of validation. We have 2 types. We have the exploratory factor analysis and the confirmatory factor analysis. Exploratory is when you are trying out a relationship that is not existent, or you are exploring possibility of the relationship. Confirmatory is there's an a priori or there's a priori understanding or a set theory already, and you just want to confirm if the data that you have will support that theory or theorized relationship. Or expert the most abused one, I'll use abuse rather than use, is the expert validation because they can play around with the word expert. So what many students do is when they do expert validation is they identify first the people who can validate. And then when they are asked for the criteria of the experts, they will just simply look at the criteria of the qualifications of those that they have already. So very biased, di ba? So that's why I don't trust much the expert validation because I will always raise the question of who are these experts? Now, because very conveniently you can just tell people anybody as expert or assume anybody as an expert. I can I can just define expert as having the PhD. Apparently, not all PhD holders are experts. So, masyadong bias, pwedeng maluwag at pwedeng paglaruan. That's why I don't trust much expert validation because lalo na pag walang oras yung sinasabi mong expert, sabi niya, oo, maganda na yung questionnaire mo. Ang ganda ng pagkagawa ng questionnaire mo. Tamang-tama ang questionnaire mo. Wala lang akong oras. Tapos bayaran mo na
Sir,
ako
kasali ba sa
5,000.
sir? Kasali ba sa expert validation yung mga statisticians, sir?
Hindi
To
yun
interpret
kasi
your data. Hindi sila
yun,
kasali.
interpretation yun. Ang validation kasi is you have to ask them for a certain criteria. For example, you can ask them whether masabtan ba. Another one is makuha ba nimo ang imong gi-expect nga tubag ana nga klase nga pangutana. So that's a
Okay.
validation. Kasi validation is the test of validity is whether you will be able to get the answer that you need given your question. So it's like hitting the bullseye in your darts. Okay, so it's valid if you will hit the bullseye. If it is far from the bullseye, it's not valid. So if the questionnaire or the question will give you the answer that you need, then that's valid. If it will not give you the answer that you need, it's not valid. Right? Have you heard about the illustration showing the difference between validity and reliability? Using darts as an illustration. The darts board, the darts board? Do you play darts? Darts kasi, yung sikag tira, di ba? Okay, so it can illustrate the difference between reliability and validity. Reliability kasi is the consistency of the answers. For example, if you ask GRMSU students, if you ask Siliman students, if you ask De La Salle students, they will have a consistent answer to a particular item. That's reliability. Okay, so if you translate that into tira sa darts board, it's on the consistency of your landing point. Asa siya nitugpa. So pwede siyang consistent nitugpa sa tumoy, layo, sa bullseye, but it's consistent. Meaning to say, it's not valid, it's far from the bullseye, but it's consistent. So the instrument can be reliable, but not valid. So consistent ang tubag, pero dili siya valid. Tungod kay ang tubag layo sa imong gikinahanglan nga pangutana. Do you see the point? So that's how we illustrate the difference between reliability and the validity. So a good instrument is consistent nga tugpa, pero ang tugpa is on the bullseye. That's a good instrument, right? Because it's consistent. Even if you ask students from other places, they will answer the similar things. And the similar things that they answer are the things that you need. And that's the bullseye. So again, an instrument can be valid but not reliable. An instrument can be reliable but not valid.
Not valid.
Layo kay sa bullseye. Consistent man, reliable man, murang dili siya always good indicator of a quality instrument ang reliability because it only shows consistency. Okay? The correlation of the answers. Highly correlated ang answers because they are the same. But are these the answers that you need? It may not be valid. Okay tayo? Sige. Let's go to the next part of the discussion para mahumanta. Uy, 10:30 na. Okay. Kita na?
Yes, sir.
Let's discuss this very quickly. We go back to the quantitative data. We go back to the quantitative hypothesis testing. What do we test? The hypothesis. What are hypotheses? These are our theorized or assumed relationship of the variables. So we have a set of variables. Where do we get the set of variables in our quantitative research? From the theories that we read, from the concepts that we extracted from the theory. So these are our sources of variables, all right? So, and then we hypothesize that this variable 1 is related to variable 2 in this particular manner. So how do we deal with the data that we generate for each of these variables? For example, survey. When you get the survey data already, how do you deal with the survey data? So there are two major directions of analysis of quantitative data. One is the descriptive direction. The other one is the inferential direction. You know that in statistics, that you can have the descriptive analysis and the inferential analysis. Maybe this is the basis of those who will use the word descriptive as a design, but it's not a design. It's a type of statistical analysis. Okay, so you describe descriptively your data, or you analyze descriptively your data. So how do you, when you say descriptive, you are simply describing a variable. When you describe a variable, you don't need another variable to describe it. For example, you want to describe the class in terms of their average in a particular test. So you don't need other variables to describe the class in terms of their performance in a test. You just simply need their performance in the test, period. So that's descriptive. The difference with inferential is you cannot have an inferential for just one variable because inferential suggests relationship. Do you follow? In the descriptive analysis, you are simply describing. In inferential analysis, you are establishing relationship. So in relationship, it cannot be just one variable, right? So it's ridiculous to have relationship of just one person. You cannot relate, you know, one to
Wala niya
yourself.
mabati.
Diba? So kinahanglan jud og another, at least a pair to have a relationship. So in statistics, you can have more than two to be related. Okay, but you cannot have one, right? You can have the descriptive analysis of one variable, but when you say inferential, because you're dealing with relationships in inferential, eh. So that's the difference. So in descriptive analysis, you can describe the variable in terms of frequencies, pila ka buok, percentages, pila ka buok in terms of the overall number. Measures of central tendency, asa nagkumpol, asa nagcluster ang ato ang mga scores, right? Okay. Inferential analysis is establishing relationship. One variable is allowed to relate to another variable. Okay, tuloy tayo. In inferential analysis, because we say that we are establishing relationship in inferential analysis, two major types of relationships can be tested. One is association or relationship of association, or we call it the associational inferential analysis. The other one is the relationship of difference. One is unsa sila kapareho, that's association. You follow? The
Sige,
other
sir.
one is the difference. Unsa sila ka lahi, right? So when you say relationship, it's either they are the same or they are different. So when you test for an association, you're testing how similar the variables are. When you're testing the difference, you are testing how different the variables are. Do you follow? Okay, so when you describe, you don't have to compare with another variable. But when you do inferential analysis, you are comparing one variable relative to another, or you are establishing a relationship. And when you say relationship, it's either relationship of association or difference. Association is how similar, difference is how different. Follow? Okay, so association will use some correlational analysis, some regression if you want to go higher. And then difference will have the different types of t-test. T-test is comparing two groups. ANOVA is comparing more than two groups. Okay, so we'll have time to discuss each of these, but I want you to discover these things in your literature or systematic literature review. So I hope you will remember this. When you say correlation, you're testing how similar they are. Regression is how similar they are, but you will quantify the degree as to each of these variables or associated variables affect to another. So correlation, there is no cause and effect. There's no causal relationship. In regression, there is a causal relationship. In correlation, you are simply saying that the two variables are related. In regression, you are simply you're telling that one variable affects the other. Okay, so pag sinabi nating effect, dili ka tubag si correlation anak. Ang sinabi lang ni correlation is they're correlated. They are related. But if you want to find out whether the relationship results to causal or causal, meaning to say one variable affects the other, then you do regression. For example, another crazy example. So if you happen to be in a particular place, beach for example, and then your best friend is also there, then you are correlated because You are both in the same place. Right? So there's a pattern of similarity. There's a pattern of association. But it is not causal because you are not the reason why she's there. And she's not the reason why you are there. Do you follow?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's correlation only without any causal implication. But if you say that I want to find out if I am the reason why she was there, then you do some level of regression. Because regression will tell you the impact of one variable on the behavior of another. So if you want to quantify how much I influence her to go to the beach because I'll be there, then that's regression. Okay tayo? So if you want to say that there is a correlation between the volume of makeup and the academic performance of students, you do correlation. But if you want to find out specifically how much each centimeter or each millimeter volume of makeup will affect the academic performance of the student, then you do regression because you can quantify the specific impact of one variable on another. Follow? Next is the difference. The t-test, as I have said, is comparing two groups. What's the difference between the two groups? So if you notice, these are common in quasi-experimental and experimental designs. You will ask, is there a significant difference between group 1 and group 2? So mga inana ng mga pangutana, classic na siya. They call it the canonical forms. Okay, mo gina siya yung mga usual statement sa mga kinaraan nga mga mag-research. Pero sa bagong kapanahunan, wala na inana kaayo. You can ask the question in any way you want. Dili na mo follow ato mga canonical forms. I do not know sa Jeremy's kung traditional pa paghihapon ng ato ang mga researchers din magpabutang paghihapon sila. Is there a significant difference between blah blah and blah blah in terms of? Okay. So after if you compare two groups, you use the t-test, and if you compare more than two, you use the ANOVA. Okay, so or the single factor ANOVA or the one-way ANOVA. Okay, tayo? So, hanggang doon lang. And then, pag mga specific details to this, maybe in the middle of the term, I will spend another time discussing those to you. So, I will demonstrate how to do correlation regression, t-test, ANOVA, ANCOVA, MANOVA, and even, if you have time, I will demonstrate also how to do some structural equation models. Maybe that could help you also. Next. Sa qualitative research design, let's talk in this presentation the components of qualitative designs, positionality and reflexivity, procedures in data collection, data analysis, interpretation, and the issues of validity and reliability. Characteristics of qualitative research methods. As we have said, quali is pertaining to the use of verbal data or data other than the quantified data. The very first characteristic of a quali research is you do the data collection in a very natural setting. Meaning to say, as much as possible, the process of interview, for example, should mimic the natural environment of the informant. How do you demonstrate that? For example, pag nag-interview ka, ayaw butang og harang. Dapat walay table. So kung ikaw boss ka sa opisina, ayaw ipatawag ang imuhang empleyado tungod kay boss ka, and then you do the interview for your research. It's not like that because it's not a natural setting. Okay, so it's a natural setting if you observe these informants, or if you get the information in a place that they use in an environment where they normally belong. So kung classroom teacher siya, schedule the interview inside the classroom without the table perhaps, or if friendly mo siya, then the usual way you deal with a friend, perhaps over a cup of coffee, for example. You have to, as much as possible, maintain the natural setting in a way that the participant will feel that this is that I'm free to act and to speak naturally. So dili nila ma-feel nga kinahanglan ko mo-bluff, kinahanglan ko murag scripted mo istorya. In qualitative research, researcher is a key instrument. So you have the interview protocol, for example, but the best protocol and the best instrument to collect the data is the researcher himself. What's the implication of this? It only implies that the researcher has to do the data collection. In qualitative research, it is not advisable to ask somebody to gather the data for you because that somebody may have a different interpretation or may have a different analysis of the responses of the participant or the informant. The advantage of using the researcher as the person who will gather the data is that power failure. Madungog ba ko?
Yes, sir.
Wala. Bigla.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Medyo low voltage.
Low voltage na to. Sa mga taga-dapitan, siguro na feeling nyo. Okay. So, a researcher, it's an advantage when the researcher himself is the ones gathering the data because the researcher can interact with the responses of the informant. Unlike when you ask somebody else, wala mo siya pakialam because in the first place, dito niya research. Di siya kabalo kung saan pag-react, kung saan pag-proseso, kung sa'y next nga ipangutana. Okay, so another thing is, in qualitative research, you can have multiple sources of data. In fact, you do not specify ahead of time your sources of data. Maybe you can start with just the students, and then eventually you decided along the way that you need inputs from the teachers, and you decided along the way that you need inputs from the parents, for example. So as I've said, it's very emerging, and sources of data may not be predefined. In qualitative research, you welcome meanings attributed by the participants. You deal with the participants' meaning. So when you say participants of the research, kisay atong gi-refer ani?
Mga
Who are the
respondents
participants?
mo.
Okay, respondents. Who else? Who are the participants of a
researcher.
qualitative research?
The researcher,
The
sir. Pwede
researcher
siya.
himself. All right. So when you say participants' meanings, it's basically the interaction of the meanings of the informants and the researcher himself and all others who have a stake on the research being conducted. Okay, so it's not just about what objectively the participants say. It's also about your understanding about what the participants are saying. So it is not about quantifying how many times the participants said the idea. And it's not about how many of the participants said the idea. It doesn't matter because what is important is the idea has been said. So you don't count how many times it was said and how many people or participants said it. So I hope you two will never quantify a qualitative data. So I always, I fail students when they put a frequency count as to how many times an idea is being said in a qualitative research. So that's also an illustration of how quantitative we think in research. Even in qualitative research, we still quantify. We put some frequency counts. That's a stupid analysis because it's a qualitative research. It's stupid because it's qualitative research and then you are putting some frequency count which are highly quantitative. It doesn't matter because in qualitative research, what is important is the idea or the meaning that the participants put into a particular phenomenon or into a particular observable practice. Okay? It's characterized by an emergent design, meaning to say you cannot really plan perfectly the qualitative research. Qualitative research is a messy process, meaning to say what you plan at the start may not necessarily be what you will implement in the actual conduct of the research. Do you follow? Because it's emergent. I'd like to justify the design, why it has to be like that. The more that you interact with the informants, the more that you will understand your problem. The more that you understand your problem, the more focused your research becomes. The more focused your research becomes, the more defined your direction will be. So if you think that you are no longer addressing a very important problem, then you have to leave that problem rather than continue just because it was what you have started. But you have to dismiss that and do something else. Research on something else or investigate something else. What's the point of investigating a problem that you already know the answer? So maybe at the start you think you think it is an unanswered question. But along the way you realize it has already been answered. So what's the point of having a research question that has already been answered? So that's what we mean by an emergent design. So if you discover that along the way, then I have to shift to another focus in my research. I have to ask something else, something that has not been answered yet. Follow?
Yes, sir.
Next is the
Yes.
reflexivity process. Reflexivity means that you are interacting with the sources of data or information actively or proactively in fact. When you say proactively interacting, it doesn't you don't just listen to the words of the participants, you interact. During interview, you are free to confront. You can tell the participant that is not what I know. That is not what I believe. So it is doing qualitative research and doing interview is not just about objectively recording what they say. Interact with them. Tell them that this is what you know and this is opposite or this is contradictory to what they are saying. Do you follow? So, dili siya objective manggod. So, ang atong idea siguro sa qualitative research is mangutana ko kung unsa iyang tubag, mao gitoy akong i-report. Mao gitoy sakto. It's not like that. Because qualitative research is reflexive. When you say it's reflexive, nakaibuot. Kasi kung inato imong idea, o makaibuot. Di ba? So, mura kag researcher nga may buot. So, qualitative research are not like that. Qualitative researchers are also thinkers. So because you're a thinking being doing a research, you have to invoke what you think and what you know, what you experience about a certain topic or a concept. In the first place, you will not study a concept that you do not know. You will not study a concept or a topic that you do not have any background of. That's why in our second task, in our assignment, I leave it to you to figure out what are the questions that are important to you or what is the critical question that is highly significant to your discipline or to your field, because I want it to come specifically from your own perspective and experience. Okay, so if it comes from your own perspective or experience, you can relate. It means that when the informant or the interviewee will tell you something, you will just play deaf and blind. You have to interact and you tell him if you agree or you disagree. That's reflexivity. If you don't do that, then that is not a good qualitative research because that is an objective research. You are simply reporting what they are saying. You are not even clarifying if it is correct, if it is true. You're not validating if he has proof, if he has feel free to do that in your qualitative research and feel free to tell the participant that you are lying. It seems that you are lying. It seems that that is not what I find, what I observe. So feel free to confront the participant if you think that the participant is bluffing. Again, the most important thing in the process is you get the correct information. If you don't do that, you will not be able to get the correct information. You will just be reporting some bluffs in your qualitative research. Follow? Any reaction? Okay. Sige, I will assume again that you understood this. It's a holistic account. Okay. All right. It's a qualitative popular qualitative designs. Parang Vietnamese, no? May po. There are popular research designs. Disregard the H. Narrative research, phenomenological. Anong narrative research? Biographies. Okay, narratives. Or interviews. You know, narrative of people. A case narrative, for example. Phenomenological, lived experiences. The lived experiences of things like this. Okay. Ethnography, pertaining to a particular ethnic group or a particular cultural group. You do a study about them. Case study is any case for that matter. One student, case of one student, case of one class, case of one group, for example. Grounded theory, and then other designs like the participatory action research, discourse analysis, etc. Reflexivity, as I've said, is the interaction of the self and the rest. We had this article on the model of reflexivity uh, as a way of series of interactions between the researcher and the informant, the researcher and the auditor, things like that. Data collection procedures, you have the observation, using the observation protocol, do some interviews, document analysis, some audiovisual materials. Okay. In analyzing qualitative data, the purpose basically is to make sense or articulate what specifically the data is telling you about. So if it tells you to react, then you react. If it tells you to express your own bias also, then express your own bias. So basically, in qualitative research, we confront our biases. We confront our own biases and we confront other person's biases. We confront the bias of the informant. We confront our own bias. And we embrace subjectivity. When we say we embrace subjectivity, we always operate on the idea that we are different. Even if we discuss our own biases, even if we attempt to agree, it doesn't mean that we will always end up agreeing. So in qualitative research, because we embrace subjectivity, it is advisable to confront your differences. But it doesn't mean that in the end you will agree on something. So it's just enough that you tell him that you have a different idea. It doesn't always mean that you have to agree on one thing because it's not the purpose of qualitative research. The purpose of qualitative research is to draw out all the ideas. And these ideas do not necessarily agree all the time. So build on what aspect you agree on, but report the things that you disagree about. Okay, so it entails coding, the process of coding, memoing, and conceptualization. So I will see how data are grouped together or responses are grouped together, and the process of naming this particular group of data responses, and so forth and so on. In terms of validity and reliability, there's really these are really not our concern in qualitative research, because these are concerns of the quantitative paradigm or the positivist research paradigm. So we call this the holy trinity of quantitative research: the validity, reliability, and the generalizability. So when you ask me, is it valid, sir, that subjective masyado yung qualitative research? Is it reliable? So when we say validity, as I have illustrated in quantitative research, it pertains to whether you are able to get the information that you need. So in qualitative research, this is basically represented by or illustrated by how much you are able to access the faculty of the informant to draw out the correct information or the appropriate information. So if you are able to draw out the appropriate information, then your process is valid. Correct? because that's the intention of validity. See, if you're able to cause the participant to speak or to tell the information that you need, then you are having a valid research. Because apparently you're able to get and draw out. Okay, so if you report it faithfully, even if you don't agree, but you report the disagreement, you don't fake results. You don't put words onto the mouth of the participant or the informant, then that makes the process reliable. Why? Because if you ask the same question again to the same participant after a certain period of time, apparently you will be getting a similar response. And that makes the process reliable. If you fake results, if you put words into the mouth of the participant and the informant and you uh, report a different thing, and you ask again the participant after a certain period of time, and he will or she will go back to her old answer, there's a discrepancy now between what you reported and then this uh, re-articulated answers. Because in the first place, you lied in your report. So the only thing that can make the process reliable is you report faithfully whatever you gathered from the participants. Don't fake results. Just because you do not agree with the participant and I'm telling you that you have the right to object, it doesn't mean that you will report your own. Okay, so kung nag-disagree mo, kung wala ka nakauyon sa iyang tubag, it doesn't make you right. It doesn't make you correct. So what I'm saying is that you report both. You report her answer and you report your disagreement or your dissent to the answer. Follow? Okay. Validity can be in a form of triangulation. Maybe you have the data from the quali and then you do the triangulation using the quanti. Okay. Member checking, you go back to the member, ask the participant, this is what I gathered from you. Is this correct? Rich, thick description, meaning to say you provide so many descriptions or elaborations. Addressing biases, confronting the biases, meaning to say you will not only report your agreement, you will also report your disagreements. And that is what is more important. For me, when I check qualitative research, I am always looking at where do you disagree? Because if I look at what they agree on, I will just look at the introduction. I will not look at the data anymore because in the first place, that's what you intend to happen, to agree. But I'll be more interested to look at what aspects that they do not agree with because this will open new research. This will open new investigation. Negative, discrepant information, prolonged time, peer debriefing, external auditor. Reliability is checking of transcript whether there is mistake in the representation of the responses. Ensuring that there's no drift in the definition of codes, so you have to make sure that the codes are consistently defined. If there will be intercoders, you'll have a proper coordination with the intercoders and cross-checking. All right, so that's for the quali. Then let's proceed to the mixed methods research design. Okay, so in mixed methods research design, I'll be presenting the different strategies of mixing methods. Okay, so the first type of mixing method is the parallel and convergent. Okay, so the key assumption is the qualitative and the quantitative data can both provide different types of information, but each information provided is unique and significant. Often detailed views of participants qualitatively and scores in instruments quantitatively, and together they yield results that neither the two will be able to provide sufficiently when they are taken as a standalone data source. Okay, so in convergent parallel, you simply have quali and quanti and then compare. Okay, so that's how it looks like. Convergent parallel is you have the quanti data collected independent of the quali data over here. Do you follow? The quanti collected independently of the quali, and then you merge their results, compare their results or relate their results, and then you interpret. So when you say that they are gathered independently, if you notice, they are parallel. So quali, quanti, walay connection dire. So ibig sabihin sabay. Not necessarily the same time, the same place. When you say sabay, ang questions nimo sa quanti walay kinalaman sa questions sa quali. O ang questions nimo sa quali walay kinalaman sa imong questions sa quanti. So independent gid siya. So the same imong purpose pero lahi kag pamaagi sa pagpangutana. Okay? So and then you compare the results if they are the same. So maybe this one is a form of a test, this one is a form of interview. Okay, so how much do you understand the lesson? Test. How much do you understand the lesson? Interview. And then you compare and interpret. We call it the convergent parallel mixed methods research design. Follow? Clear sa inyo, ha? Okay, let's go to the next. Okay. In convergent parallel, it's a side-by-side comparison or parallel comparison. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the purpose is to always... Nainangutana? Did I hear somebody speaking? Okay, sige. The purpose is to arrive at a similar result or the same result. Dapat consistent si quali o si quanti. Pero paon sa pagdili sila consistent? There's nothing wrong with your process. There's nothing wrong with your method except that you just have a special case now. So you can look at it as a study limitation. That's the fastest way to address it. Sabi mo na lang, it entails another set of investigation. You can do it on your own after my thesis. Or you can address that. You can investigate. Asa kami nagka-problema. Nganong kung pangutanon ako sila sa interview, nakasabot gud sila. Pero pag i-test na nako sila, wa man niya mo yung mga tubag. So, inconsistent. Di ba? So, dapat kasi consistent sila. Anyway, so, that's the implication. Okay? Next. Another one is the sequential design. But let's start with the explanatory sequential. In explanatory sequential, one design explains the other. All right? So in this case, what happens is the qualitative design or the qualitative data is used to explain the results of the quanti. Okay, so the researcher collects the quantitative data first, and then it uses the qualitative data to explain the results of the quanti. So what's the implication? You get the result first of the quanti. So you analyze first the quantitative data before you ask questions in the quali. So if you go back to our example kanina, so nanay siya test. Maba kayo sila sa test. So dili na ka mangutana random sa interview. Mangutana na ka sa interview nganong maba ka og result. Unsay wala nimo nasabdan. In that case, it will explain nganong baba sila sa quanti. You follow? So this is how it looks like. We have the quanti. Look at the explanatory. You have the quantitative data collection analysis, and then you follow it up with quali. So the quali now will explain the result of the quanti. So you have to analyze this first before you gather the quali. Dili sabay. So unahon nimo ang quanti, nakay result dapat sa quanti before ka mag-quali. Kaya ang imong question sa quali, based man sa result sa quanti. So kung taas ang ilang score sa quanti, mangutana ka kung sa'y nakatabang nila para mas nasabtan nila. Pero kung mubo ang ilang result sa quanti, mangutana ka kung sa'y problema, nga wa mo kasabot. Right? So the questions in your quali now is more focused because you have the result already. The purpose of your quali in the first place is to explain the result of your quanti. Do you follow?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's one way of mixing the method. Okay, so the other type of sequential is the exploratory. Ganiha, explanatory. Karon exploratory. In exploratory, the opposite is happening. You start with the quali first and then you do a quantitative data collection and analysis to compare with the results of the quali or to build the results of the quali. So it's like this. You have the qualitative first, and then you have the quantitative data collection analysis. So what happens? In the qualitative, for example, you do an interview. And then when you analyze the interview, you are able to develop a set of constructs. Okay, and you develop a test. So when you develop a test, ang next phase ato is quanti na. Okay, nag-test naman ka. So ang imong test base siya sa interview. So karon inig administer nimo sa test, quanti na siya. So karon ang result nimo sa test will tell whether katong imuhang nakuha nga mga data sa quali is consistent. So that's what we mean by exploratory. Common ni siya nga gigamit sa mga nag-develop og instruments. Because when they develop the instrument, where do they get the items in the instrument? Either from interview or from literature synthesis or literature review. Clear? Questions? All right. So if your strategy of mixing quali and quanti doesn't fall on any of the three, then don't worry. We call it the advanced. So in any manner that you want to combine quali and quanti, it's acceptable because that's what you think is needed based on your context of research. So we have the embedded, we have the transformative, we have the multi-phase, in any manner that you want. So nag-quali, and then nag-quanti, nag-quali, then nabalik ko quanti, nag-quanti na ka, then duha ka quali, or nag-quanti kag kaduha, then nag-quali na po ka. So it's acceptable in any manner you want to combine. So mahimo na siya asa ani nga mga pamaagi. So don't worry. So any manner, as I've said, Creswell will tell you that it's a valid research, mixed methods research design. You just follow these notations. So you put an arrow if it is a sequential, you put a plus if it is convergent, you put a reverse arrow if it is a recursive, you put a parenthesis if it is within a series of studies, you put a it's a tawag ani? Shade. So tawag ani bracket, right? It's a bracket, and you put a parenthesis if it is within a framework. Okay, so I started.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Mas matrabaho ba, sir, ang mix methods or compare sa quanti lang or quali?
Obviously, yes.
Lagi, sir, kay based sa akong
Magduha
experience
mga, doble
sa
man ka.
undergrad. Oo, sir. Mas matrabaho gid siya, sir. Dayon naay jud siya tendency, sir, no nga naay kanang mga part ba didto ba nga murag ma-conflict o unsa ba na naay conflict
Sa mga
or
results.
dili magkatugma ang sa mga
It's
results.
okay. Normal
Kumbalik.
gina siya. So, it's a matter of how you deal with those. Kasi ang uban ana, mo kasi mong advisor og mali na day sa mali gina imong research day kay nganong di man na pareha imong result day. Di na mao.
Tama, sir. Dayon naay tendency, sir, kay kanang ipabalik sa imo
So mali si advisor. Si advisor ang naay problema, dili ikaw. Dili ang imong research design. Kayo tarong si advisor, she will tell you na explain na day nganong di na pareho day. Kayo
lagi, sir.
mag-research ka unya lahi ang imong na-achieve sa imong expect na ma-achieve, walay problema sa imong research. Nalang gyud
Dayon
discrepancy
na
or results.
sir, naka-kuan po bi, sir, kay sa mag-interpret ba sa among data, sir, kay nagkuha mag-statistician. Dayon mura og kanang naay part dito nga maglisod mi og defend ba
Yeah.
sa among data. Ito mo
Okay,
kung wala
gibalo nun ta nimong statistician para mo defense mo.
makatagam man, sir.
Ayan, di pa ka pwede matagam kinapa kay laing nga research, mag-research pa ta karon.
Lagi.
Hilak na lang.
Sige lang, carry lang.
Sige, tiwasa na to. Hapit na ta. Mga one slide na lang. Okay. I started by convincing you to do mixed methods research, and I'll end with the same. I will always advocate mixed methods research because of the flexibility of the design. Because when you do mixed methods research, whatever kind of data, whatever type of data that you will face with, you will not be intimidated because you know how to deal with those types of data. So the advantage of mixed methods research is when you are about to do a research and the best way to do a research is a particular design, then you will not, you will not say na hindi mo kaya kasi kabisado mo rin. So, flexibility. I encourage you to learn both quali and quanti. So, in your systematic literature review, you will really learn quali and quanti because I will ask you to not to be selective with the design. So, you accept whether it's quali or quanti or mixed, and you will be compelled to understand those because apparently they deal with both. I encourage you to to learn both quali and quanti and mixed. Okay.
What is my
Okay.
premise?
Okay. So I guess that's all that I need to brief you regarding the quali, the quanti, and the mixed methods research. And I think at this point, it's enough for you to be familiar with how research are being conducted. So when I say you are familiar with how research is being conducted, when you read articles or when you read journal reports, that means that you are familiar already with the terms that they will use there or the process that they underwent in order to come up with that particular article or journal. Okay, so at least this time, when you read articles, you can relate why they are saying this, why they're doing this.